Good morning, and thank you for joining us today at the American Enterprise Institute for this discussion on spectrum management with Federal Communications Commissioner Brendan Carr, followed by a panel discussion with Peter Rasavi, Tricia Paoletto, and Joel Thayer. In the last few years, there have been a very active discussion around the restructuring and the use of our finite spectrum assets. As a key component of this is the building out of our next generation networks, often called 5G, which is a specific mobile build out. Commissioner Carr has traveled across the country, talking to local network operators and their workforce about what it would take to ensure a successful transition to this next generation of network operations. In 2017 to 2019, Commissioner Carr focused on the importance of the actual deployment challenges of physical equipment to ensure network operations are prepared for the technological migration. And at the same time, here in Washington, he worked with his fellow commissioners to review and deploy better spectrum management policies that ensure the best current use of our limited spectrum assets. This means giving market incentives, when necessary, to current spectrum holders of highly valued frequencies of spectrum, while ensuring that they would continue to have access to the spectrum that would fit their needs by using newer technical capabilities that enable for more efficient spectrum use. Due to its unique properties, 5G can utilize low, mid, and high spectrum bands in a way that are far superior to our prior uses of these valued assets of spectrum. With consumer and commercial wireless use increasing rapidly, spectrum's scarcity means we need to review how we use this valued asset and how we can create opportunities to share it when possible. Today, we will look at several spectrum sharing instruments, including the open sharing model known as unlicensed spectrum, the cooperative spectrum sharing idea, and the idea of a dynamic sharing spectrum if it's viable and works as well. So Commissioner Carr, welcome. Before we start talking about spectrum sharing, tell us about what you have learned over the past few years traveling around the United States and how the work you've been doing at the FCC will help enhance the connectivity across the United States. Specifically, you were doing what you're calling on Twitter, the car trips outside of Washington. So can you give us some of the lessons learned there?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Shane. Thank you to AEI for hosting this event. I think it's great to get to chat a little bit about spectrum as we kick off our transition here into the next administration. You know, you mentioned these car trips, and when I got sworn into this job back in 2017, you know, the very first thing I did was try to get outside of DC. And since then, I try to spend as much time on the road as possible, in part because I think, you know, inside the Beltway, that's not sort of always the font of every great idea. So I learned a lot more many times outside of DC than I did in DC. The very first trip I took within a week of being sworn in was down to a small town, Claremont, North Carolina, where there's a fiber manufacturing plant. And for me, that was sort of the start of what I wanted to emphasize and will continue to emphasize in my time on the commission, which is when we talk about, you know, tech and telecom, we often think about obviously spectrum policy that we're talking about here today. We think about all of the jobs that ride on these high-speed networks, but I think a lot of people lose sight of the real hard work, the construction work that it takes to build out these networks. So I tried to focus on that. And from those trips, that's really what created the ideas that I put forward on the infrastructure side to make it easier to build out these networks. When you're out in the field talking to the women and men that are sort of part of these construction crews, telecom teams, tower climbers, they'll tell you exactly what is slowing them down and what is not. And that's a very different perspective than what you may get in a typical ex parte or event here in DC. Obviously, I love those ex partes. I love talking to all of our friends in the FCBA. But there's something when you're talking the actual person that is, you know, running the directional bore, that is pulling the fiber to get their perspective. And you pick up information. I remember being, you know, out in Plymouth, Iowa, with a crew that was running fiber, and you get to ask them stuff. You know, how much does it cost you to run a mile of fiber out here? And it can be, you know, $30,000 to $50,000. You know, depending on these runs that they're doing. So it's a lot of helpful information, and that really provided the ideas that we built off of with our infrastructure reforms. And real briefly there, we've seen really, you know, remarkable results. If you look at the 4 years leading up to when Chairman Pai took over at the FCC, the U.S. had built about 4,000 new towers. There was about 708 towers that were built in in 2016 in the lead up to Pi taking over. The most recent year we have data for, 2019, there were something like 46,000 towers that were put up in this country. So when you go from 708 in 2016 new towers to 46,000 new towers in 2019, I think that shows that our regulatory process at the FCC and at all levels of the government was too slow, and we were holding back these internet builds. So it's been great to participate in some of the work that's been needed to unleash that private sector build. And obviously it's helping to close the digital divide, and that's a great thing.
On a personal note, did you know for sure that you didn't have vertigo before you went on that tower climb? I don't think I could do that.
It's funny. So, I climbed a water tower out in South Dakota, and then I kind of built from there, and it's now become sort of a thing, right? Whenever I leave DC on a trip, I'm basically not allowed back into DC unless I've climbed something. Little known fact too, though, I actually am not a big fan of heights. So when you climb up, sometimes I've done 2,000 foot towers. You really have to compartmentalize it and look at what's directly in front of you, and sort of just forget about sort of the visual and the fear associated with it. But not a huge fan of it actually. But it is a blast to spend time with these crews, and I've gotten to become friends with some of them on Facebook and follow them around, and I've got to meet up with them at multiple different events and conferences. So it's been a really rewarding part of the job.
I'm sure they appreciate you literally getting in their shoes. I mean, going up there and tackling it, because that would be a tough one for me. But you do bring up a really interesting point about the difference between rural and urban areas having very different spectrum uses. So how do you recognize those as the challenges that you're addressing in the digital divide?
Yeah, I think we at the FCC need to have a general perspective on this type of issue. What spectrum is better for urban, densely populated areas? What spectrum is going to be better for more rural areas in terms of propagation? I think obviously having a general sense of that is very important. But we don't necessarily always get it exactly right. So we got to let the private sector innovate. Obviously we talk now about the importance of 3 different layers of spectrum, from low band to mid band to high band spectrum, and everything sort of in between. And so I think the key there is we let the private sector experiment. And early on, people thought small cells would only be in the most densely populated parts of the country. And obviously I've seen them in football stadiums in rural parts of the country, main streets on small towns. And so we have a general sense, but then need to let the private sector take it from there. And when you look back, generally what we've done with spectrum, I'm pretty proud of the work that we've accomplished and that Chairman Pai has helped us accomplish. And just looking through the spectrum bands that we've moved on in the last 3 to 4 years, at 2.5 gigahertz, we updated our rules for EBS. We're going to have an auction coming up soon on 2.5. At 3.5 gigahertz, we worked, including with Commissioner O'Reilly's leadership, to update and modernize our rules there. C-band, obviously, 3.7 to 4.2. Probably have to pause a second there. Obviously, we have an $80 billion auction going on right now for that. So that looks to be a really big success. And that was a tough one. That was one where there was a lot of moving pieces, a lot of disagreements. Wasn't a unanimous decision at the FCC. But in hindsight, kudos to Pai and his team for seeing the path forward there. 5.9 gigahertz, we've moved forward, 6 gigahertz. So we really marched through a number of spectrum bands over the past couple of years. And I think if there's any common thread to all of those is, I think it's creativity. The idea of, greenfield spectrum and easy clearing is a number of years in the rear view mirror at this point. And I think, we use a lot of different approaches. C-band, we built on some precedents and existing authorities to create this mechanism to accelerate the relocation of incumbents. And that's been a great innovation, I think. But also takes political capital. I think you have to be at the FCC, particularly the chair, has to build up some political capital and be willing to expend it. If you look at what we did at the FCC, a lot of pushback from some federal users. L-band, obviously, Legato, a lot of pushback from federal users. These are all spectrum bands that had been teed up in prior administrations, and they just, for one reason or another, didn't push to get it across the finish line. And a lot of people have said, well, isn't it dysfunctional to see DOT pushing back on our 5.9 or see DOD pushing back on Legato or see NOAA pushing back on 28 gigahertz? So what I would say to people is these quote unquote disputes have always been there, but prior kept it below the headline level because they didn't take on the fight. And I think we got to a point in this country where we need to take the tough decision spectrum out there. And I think that's going to be one of the lasting legacies of Chairman Pai, is that he did that. And so while some people point to the public exchange of views and the disputes between different agencies, I think that's a product of, finally moving forward and not letting the fear of that public dispute stop the FCC chair from making the right call. So I think those are some of the legacies that we'll see leaving the Pai FCC and hopefully picked up with whatever the name of the next FCC is going to be.
Well, I think two things that really have stuck with me throughout the last 4 years is I realize it's a lot of work to go through the regulatory red tape, that you did it and you took the time to streamline things that just didn't make sense anymore, because there's a lot of legacy at the FCC that needs to be moved forward. So major kudos to your team and the rest of the commissioners for that. But also, let's actually go back to the C-band auction. I mean, $80 billion seems unprecedented. I don't think anybody's expecting the number to be that high. And it certainly kind of tells a story that this was, I don't know if the market was just ready for this, that you guys did a good job on getting the prep. So everybody was, it just seemed like there was a lot of puzzle pieces fell in place and not by accident to make this whole situation a success and really put us on a glide path. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, just over $80 billion right now. The clock keeps ticking up. I think there's a number of factors there. One, I think when we came into these jobs in 2017, the spectrum cupboard was bare, is probably the best way to put it. And so I think there had been some pent up demand. Took a lot of work by Pai and his team to get all of the mid-band spectrum that we've been able to get across the finish line the last couple of years. I think if you look back to maybe midway through 2016 to now, we've freed up something like 6 gigahertz worth of licensed spectrum and hundreds, thousands of megahertz of unlicensed spectrum. C-band's interesting. All of us that have lived through a number of these spectrum fights, it's interesting. Every couple of years, there's a new beachfront spectrum band that is perfect for whatever people want to do right now. Obviously, 600 was that, 700 was that before it, and then C-band sort of became it, given the unique characteristics of the band, given the spectrum that we needed to get out there. So I think it was a combination of the hard work to actually get this spectrum out there, and people today putting a premium on mid-band spectrum, although we've seen that premium placed in different places over the years. As I mentioned, it was on 600, 700. So I think a number of unique factors. Personally, I'm interested to see who the winners are, who's bidding. I don't track that. I don't follow that. I know there's a lot of speculation out there, but I got nothing to add to the speculation as to who's bidding and what industry segments are bidding, because I don't track that information while the bidding's going on.
Well, also the same year that we got a Nobel Prize for the concept of spectrum auctioning, and you guys just put right in place. It's really interesting to watch from an economic perspective. You often mentioned the interagency challenges. I think some of it along from many years have been spectrum hoarding, as I would consider it. They just sort of mine, I have it and I don't want to give it up. And no one ever really had, as you mentioned, the political will to say, we need to revisit this. We only have X amount of this interesting resource and you're not necessarily using it to its best current use. And some of them came to the party dragging and kicking. And I get the sense that the others are still not in the room. How are we doing on the interagency collaboration?
As I mentioned, some of the stuff that we're seeing and that people point to as, disputes or dysfunction, those are issues and differences of agreement that have long existed. They just never made it into the headlines because the FCC never moved forward on these tough bands. But I do think there's a path forward for us to further improve the coordination between agencies. I think with Commissioner Symington coming on board at the FCC, I think he's going to be a very valuable voice in these discussions. He obviously spent time before here at NTIA representing federal spectrum holders. So I think he'll have a unique perspective and I think potentially unique standing to help bridge the gap between commercial and federal sector users. So I'm really looking forward to his work, obviously generally at the FCC, but in particular in this interesting intersection of federal users and commercial users. I think there's still room to go forward with freeing up some additional federal spectrum. As you know, federal users aren't known to be the most efficient users of spectrum. But the good news is I think we have a pipeline going forward. Again, I mentioned in 2017, the spectrum cover was bare. There really wasn't much of a pipeline. That's far from the case now. In terms of a spectrum roadmap, I think this year alone, we can do a number of things. One, obviously, we can hold the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum auction this year. Two, this year as well, I think we have a path for moving on 100 megahertz in the 3 gigahertz band. The key there is going to be doing so at power levels that are commensurate with what we're seeing right now in the C-band auction. And then also this year, I think 6 gigahertz, we have teed up still moving forward with a proposal to open that up to what we call VLP, very low power. 3 bands are primed for action this year, which is a good thing. And on 6 gigahertz, we also can move forward on this concept of allowing client-to-client device communication, which we just issued a public notice on. So those 3 bands, I think, are ripe for action this year. Next year, we also have some spectrum bands primed for moving forward on, whether it's 1.5 is one of them that I'm looking at, and also millimeter wave. I think we can come back to putting some more spectrum out there, including potentially 42 gigahertz. And then after next year, I have some more ideas about additional bands that are teed up. But this is good news because, when I came into the FCC as a general counsel in 2017, one of the very first projects I worked on was an NOI looking at basically, 3 gigahertz up to 20 gigahertz. And at the time, a lot of people said, there's just nothing there. We've turned over every rock. We've looked over under every stone. There's no more spectrum out there. And you go from that perspective to where we are now with not only having freed up gigahertz upon gigahertz of spectrum over the last 3 or 4 years, we have a clear roadmap right now to continue to put spectrum out there.
That's fantastic. I love this idea that you're out on a bike ride thinking about maybe we aren't maximizing life.
That's right.
I know you've also done a lot of work on telehealth. So just yesterday on the commission, you voted to approve your first round of awardees for the Connected Care program. So can you explain to us how the program came about and how it relates to FCC's COVID telehealth program?
Yeah, this is something that I am super excited about. I put it in my top, certainly in my top, 1 or 2 or 3 priorities at the FCC that I've been emphasizing. It's been a little overshadowed by our work on infrastructure and spectrum, but it's one of my top priorities is telehealth. And this came from getting out of DC. One of my first trips was to Mississippi. I was with my then chief of staff, Jamie Suskin, and we were meeting with different healthcare providers. And the FCC has long supported the build out of internet connections to healthcare facilities. And that work is great. That lets you, send an MRI to, a hub facility that has experts there rather than you having to travel to that facility. Obviously, there's all kinds of high quality care that you get in a connected facility itself. What we saw, though, was as soon as those doors open up and you walk out of the healthcare facility, you go from having access to the highest quality care to basically zero. And it doesn't need to be that way anymore. We've got all these innovations with, smartphone apps, connected devices. If you have diabetes now, you have Bluetooth-enabled blood glucose monitors. So from your home, you can prick your finger, your device will show your A1C level and give you instant feedback. So this is one of those ideas that we're on the road in the Mississippi Delta, meeting with a rural healthcare provider, and they told us about this pilot they had that did exactly that, kept people connected to the facility once they were home. It wasn't just replicating the care that you get inside of a facility. It was better care because it's keeping you healthy, right? So the most expensive part of our healthcare system is the emergency department. When people get so sick that they end up there. If we can keep people healthy, keep them out of the emergency department, it's better for them in terms of outcome. And economically, it's great for the cost of providing healthcare in this country. So the mustard seed of the idea was out there meeting with people. And we came back and started an NOI on this and then an NPRM on this. And obviously COVID came in, and we were able to use that record we had already developed to stand up an emergency COVID-19 program that Congress funded. And now we move forward with the Connected Care program that you mentioned, but they're all very, very similar at the end of the day. We voted on our first batch of awardees this week that should be public, if not today, tomorrow, maybe very soon. So I'm excited about that. And now Congress has doubled down. They're giving us another, I believe, $250 million to do a round 2 of the emergency program. So I couldn't be more pleased with how the FCC's team has captured this new trend in telehealth and has moved quickly to support it. And, kudos to the Wireline Bureau and their teams. They've worked a tremendous amount to get these programs stood up. So grateful for all that they've done.
I saw you at one of those events where you were talking about the Mississippi program, and there was at the App Association, and they had a gentleman there who created something that was basically like a bath mat that you stood on if you had diabetes, and it was actually 2G. He said, this is not a high-powered, amazing tech thing. It's very low tech, but if you stood on it long enough to brush your teeth, it would know if you had foot sores. And then he gave some amazing number of like how if you treat that early, how much money in the cost savings there is in a macro perspective, at the micro perspective, at the human level, it could really save you from getting into, a bad situation with your diabetes. I just found that fascinating. So
yeah, it's really interesting. I believe that one might be called podometrics. I might get the name wrong, but yeah, it was interesting.
2 Greek words together, podo, feet, and muck.
Exactly. It was really interesting. And yeah, you see all kinds of stuff. I mean, look, particularly with veterans, and this is one of the angles that we're focused on with this program. They tend to live in rural parts of the country when you look at just, trends in the numbers. Rural healthcare facilities are closing by the dozen around this country. I did a video call with a veteran named James, and he had like a 2-hour drive to the closest VA. And, it was a difficult drive given his condition that he had. It was also virtually impossible in the winter some months, given where he lived in some of the mountainous area of California. And now he has a direct video connection back to the VA, and they can check out his condition, monitor him. So it really is the future of healthcare. I have this saying that I use to try to encapsulate what's going on, but it's the healthcare equivalent of, shifting from Blockbuster to Netflix. You don't have to go to a physical facility to receive care. We can now get care wherever we are. And so I'm excited about it. And with COVID, HHS and other agencies moved so quickly to cut a lot of the red tape. We just made, years worth of progress in this area in terms of licensing and reimbursement during the COVID pandemic. So hopefully we can, maintain all those gains that we've made.
To tell you how well that analogy works, my father still likes to get his DVDs from people. I'm like, Dad, I can stream. He's like, no, I like the good. Your age, just you do you.
Yep.
We're going to transition over to questions. We've got some questions in front of me that have already been submitted, but if people want to submit questions, please submit them to williamrao@aei.org. That's william.rau@aei.org, or on Twitter at hashtag AskAEITech. So let's see here. First question. Sometimes there are political divides on issues at the FCC. What do you see as common ground for Democrats and Republicans when it comes to spectrum issues?
Historically, spectrum has been one of our more bipartisan areas. The challenge that we've had up to now, and why has it sort of slipped from being bipartisan to partisan, right? Our C-band decision, other decisions that we've made on spectrum and on mid-band bent towards 3-2 decisions. Part of that is because these spectrum fights have become tougher fights. Do you really want to, put your name out there against the DoD, an entity that has, aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons and strong connections to Capitol Hill if you don't have to? Well, if you're the FCC chair and you're charged with, finding spectrum and putting it to its highest value use, you should be in a position to take on those fights. So I think part of how you've seen a little bit of a split here is the implications of taking stances on spectrum today come with more consequences from a policy perspective, because there's more incumbents, there's more stakeholders, there's more interests involved. And while, I'm not someone that believes it's a zero-sum game, increasingly, some incumbents or other users that want in or out are getting pinched. And so these have become more difficult debates, and they come with, having to take some tough positions and take heat. And I think, given people's, positions, it's not always fun to do that. But again, kudos to Pi and his team for taking those fights on. So I think historically spectrum has been bipartisan, and I hope we can continue to do that, including with this, roadmap that I put forward of some bands we can make progress on.
Please keep that. You just reminded me, I was at a policy event where they were talking about broadband issues, and this 20-something policy kid next to me was literally like, it was a broadband. He had no comprehension about what the problem could be. He was like, what? And I go, it's an old legacy issue, been around for a while. Why are they having this problem? I'm like, we'll talk later. Right. There's another one. The FCC has been a world leader in auctions and using other economic radio spectrum management. What do you think the FCC should remain in the forefront? And I don't really understand the question. Why do you think that this is, and how should the FCC remain in the forefront if you think it should? Sorry, there were multiple questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that makes the U.S. stand out compared to Europe and other countries. One is our approach to spectrum auctions, as was sort of noted there. Other countries have not embraced it as much. They've tried to sort of maintain more long-term control over the spectrum. They're concerned about how do I sort of get a high return on investment for my treasury. Secondary markets is another one. I mean, it's sort of, we take it for granted in the U.S. that you can, swap spectrum, trade spectrum, and we talk about spectrum sharing. That's one way that we share spectrum on the free market, even when it's exclusive use. But it's an innovation you don't see in other countries. When I go to conferences in Europe, when I used to go to conferences in Europe, when I used to go to anywhere, people would look at you like it's strange. Why would one carrier sell spectrum to another carrier? Wouldn't that give the other one a competitive advantage? Or so I think it's an innovation that we take for granted, but it allows spectrum to flow really quickly to its highest valued use, which is a good thing. So obviously, I think we'll continue to do that. I think we need to reauthorize the FCC Spectrum Authority at some point here, and we need to continue to be creative. Again, C-band was an interesting one. The incentive auction was an interesting one. Regular straight up auctions we've done as well. So I think the creativity that we've shown over the last 2 or 3 years, we need to continue to build on that.
This is a state and local question. It says, can you talk a little bit about the steps you've taken to reduce barriers in infrastructure deployment by state and local governments, and whether there remains significant challenges in this area?
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I'm, really proud of as well. Back in late 2017, Chairman Pai tapped me to lead the wireless infrastructure effort. As I've joked before, I'm not confident that that I will continue to lead the FCC's wireless infrastructure reform efforts in the months to come. Although I'm happy to continue it, whoever the next chair is. I'll throw my hat in the ring for continuing to lead that. But we cut a lot of red tape. As I like to say, we cut it vertically. We did not cut it lengthwise, which isn't as productive. But again, if you just look at the numbers, we went from 4,000 new towers in this country in the 4 years leading up to 2017 to 47,000 towers in 2019 alone. What I found was, again, getting out of DC, spending time in small towns, rural towns. I was in a small town, Fishers, Indiana, and spent time with their mayor there, Scott Fadness. And he took me on a small cell walking tour of downtown, suburban Fishers, Indiana. And this was, 2 or 3 years ago now. He had 67 small cells in Fishers, Indiana, at a point in time when many other big eggs for attracting small cell investment. And that was curious to me. I said, what did you do? And he said, well, I understand the economics when I have competitive high-speed internet connections. So we restructured our zoning, our permitting code to be attractive. And I, pushed him for details, and those details is what ultimately led to one of the decisions that we made to put some guardrails on state and local action. Because what we found was the biggest of the big cities, because of population densities, knew that 5G and small cells would have to go there. They were charging exorbitant fees, $1 million in some cases, just to sit at the table with a city official and then pay exorbitant per site fees. So we looked at the successes that people like Mayor Fadness had, and we replicated that with guardrails at the national level. And I think that among other reforms, is what helped the private sector just have this unprecedented boom in new cell sites. It's been great because obviously no one would have predicted COVID-19, but as Americans' lives shifted onto the internet, we had those high-speed connections, and they continue to work because of the investment, because of the robust network here. Europe, other advanced countries, countries in Europe struggled to maintain the speed and resiliency of their networks because they weren't seeing the same type of investment that we saw here. The digital divide in this country has been cut nearly in half during Chairman Pai's tenure. So we were in far better shape to deal with our lives shifting onto the internet with COVID-19 in 2019, 2020 than we would have been just a few short years before.
Great. Commissioner Carr, thank you so much for being with us today. And I just want to thank you for your continued service. You guys have done a fabulous job. Your staff's always amazing, and we wish you lots of luck.
Appreciate it. Good to see you guys.
Thanks. All right. And we're going to transition over to our panel part of this discussion. So let me read some introductions to who we have coming on next. We have Joel Thayer, who's an associate at Philip Lytle, where he focuses on the practice of telecommunications, regulatory transactional matters, as well as privacy and cybersecurity. Joel also serves as outside counsel to the Lincoln Network, which is how he is joining us today. Prior to joining Philip Lytle, Joel served as the policy counsel for ACT, the App Association, where he advised on legal and policy issues related to antitrust, telecommunications, privacy, cybersecurity, intellectual property. And Joel's also worked as a legal clerk for Federal Communications Commissioner Chairman Pai and FTC Commissioner Maureen Olhausen. He also worked in Congress with Honorable Lee Terry, Go Nebraska, and Mary Bono. Tricia Pioletta is joining us. She's a partner at the law firm of Harris, Wilshire, and Granis, where she focuses on telecommunications, trade, technology policy. Tricia and her firm represent a number of clients in the wireless broadband, including satellite and ground-based, both licensed and unlicensed, and currently she serves as the head of the FCC's advisory committee for the next World Radio Conference on Spectrum Management. Tricia, we're hoping we actually get to meet in person. Tricia provides advice on regulatory, trade, and legislative policy to clients before the Federal Communications Commission and the administration. Tricia has served as a senior advisor to the International Bureau Chief and Office of the Director at the Federal Communications Commission, as well as the Director of Telecommunications and Trade Policy at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. After USTR, Tricia also served as Majority Counsel on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. I remember meeting you. We have Peter Rasavi. Peter is the president of Rasavi Research. He's a consulting firm that specializes in computer networking, wireless technology, and mobile computing since 1993. His projects include spectrum and capacity analysis, reports on the evolution of wireless technology, network security assessment, strategic consultations, system designs. He writes articles and reports, which I always love reading. He has also taught courses and does webcasts on network performance measurements, and he is often testifies as an expert in patent litigation. From 2000 to 2016, Peter was also the executive director of the Wireless Technology Association, an industry that evaluates wireless technologies, investigating mobile communications, architecture, and promoting wireless data interoperability. So I think we got the right people to have a very healthy discussion. I want to welcome you all. Please, thank you for your time today to talk about spectrum and pretty much anything else we want to put on the table. Peter, I want to start with you. The question I have found interesting is that I've been learning more about spectrum sharing and get confused sometimes is the difference between dynamic spectrum access and dynamic spectrum sharing. So can you just kind of give us table stakes to the beginning of this conversation on those two items?
Sure. The two terms are floating around the industry and causing a certain amount of confusion. The term dynamic spectrum access, or DSA, is the general engineering term for systems that access spectrum dynamically by using mechanisms such as sensing whether spectrum is currently being used by other entities. It's a general theoretical concept. Dynamic spectrum sharing, though, DSS, in contrast, is a specific capability that is currently in 5G, and it enables a 5G radio to share the same radio channel as a 4G LTE signal. This is a mechanism that has allowed operators to roll out 5G faster because they don't necessarily need to use cleared spectrum. They can use their existing 4G spectrum bands and introduce a 5G signal into that. So in the context of 5G, DSS is a very specific, well-specified capability for that specific function. What has generated confusion, though, is that the Department of Defense has issued an RFI, and it refers to dynamic spectrum sharing, DSS, which is that specific capability in 5G. So now when you say DSS, people don't necessarily know what you mean.
Yeah, I think that was part of my original confusion where I thought I knew what I was talking about, and then I wasn't sure I knew what. But one thing that seems to be common in this is that you have multiple systems that are potentially they're next to each other that aren't, so they're within a certain range, but they're not necessarily sharing spectrum. And I know that we were talking about the interagency process. You mentioned the Department of Defense. We've also had issues with the Department of Commerce through NOAA, and the Department of Transportation have also raised some considerations around this. Joel, I know you had done some work and have put some comments into the FCC around this. Do you want to bring up that topic?
Sure, always happy to bring up that topic. Well, I think you rightly noted that there are issues with the interagency process, and I think one of the problems that I don't think it's a problem that's going away. Mainly because if you really look at how spectrum's set up now, over 90% of spectrum below 8 gigahertz is shared spectrum. So you're going to run into incumbent space as more likely than not, because as we all probably can agree on, there is no longer greenfield spectrum. So you can't just do a straight clearing operation. It's inevitable that you're going to have to share. And a part of that sharing process is going to include working with government agencies to figure out the best way forward, because to harken back to, because the whole purpose of this, to harken back to what Commissioner Carr was talking about, is to deploy these types of networks efficiently, so that way we can get stronger broadband, while at the same time include new innovative uses of spectrum that we originally didn't think of. So when you think about where we sit in a lot of these different spectrum battles, whether we're sharing or we're clearing, when dealing with other agencies, it's proved to be kind of a thorn in the FCC side. You mentioned the issue with NOAA with 24 gig, where at the 11th hour, NOAA decided that even though the FCC had gone through the legal processes to clear up certain portions of that band, NOAA at the 11th hour decided that, you know what, maybe we want to rethink this. I think it was like 3 days before they were actually set to auction that side of spectrum in the 24 gigahertz band. And then you have, as Commissioner Carr rightly noted, you have these issues with DoD, with Legato. So I just think that you're going to see that as we get closer to mid-band spectrum and closer where more of these types of agencies operate, you're going to, I think most folks are going to see the FCC go head-to-head with these different agencies, unless we figure out a better and more efficient way of coordinating. And that's going to be, I think, the struggle for any FCC, whether you're in a Democrat administration or Republican administration. It's just going to be a thorn in the FCC side moving forward.
Tricia, any additional thoughts on all that interagency fund?
Yeah, I mean, that interagency fund, I think, as Commissioner Carr said, right, the battles have, they've always, or the tension has always been there. I will just note that perhaps maybe even the trade press kind of liked to focus more on the battles, in this last administration, because that was part of the narrative, frankly, about this administration. So, I mean, tensions have always been there. But with respect to moving forward with the FCC, and that battle is already kind of joined in the mid band, to Joel's point, and to Peter's. The FCC, and as commissioners as well mentioned, the FCC does have a proceeding open on sharing more of the mid-band spectrum where government radar sits, and the DoD does have a request for information about how it can share, the spectrum it holds, which currently is that 3 gigahertz spectrum, much of it. So the battles are joined, and it's going to be tricky regardless of who is the chair, because as the commissioner noted, there's a lot of bipartisanship on spectrum, when it comes to the FCC, because it is kind of the FCC against the federal users, each fulfilling their own, statutory mission.
And then going outside of the government space, you've made some very good comments I've appreciated in the past about how when we've got these the spectrum up for auction, people have been bidding on it, and so the people that are spending this money want ownership. They feel like they've got property rights they want to manage through. So how is that all kind of feeling with this current market? We feel like we've done well with the auctions going, but are we going to stay on that path? How is the industry feeling about the change in administration and where we're headed?
You want me to start on that? Yeah. So obviously there's a place as FCCs between Republican and Democrat led bodies have recognized, right? There's a place for unlicensed, there's a place for licensed. We can drill down more, later if we want on when it's appropriate. Clearly the new administration coming in with President-elect Biden, he was the vice president in the last Democrat administration, where a lot of the proponents of spectrum sharing, had a very strong reception, right? The proponents of unlicensed and more dynamic spectrum sharing, began the CBRS proceeding, which Chairman Pai finished. But I think they're going to have a very receptive ear in this new administration that's coming aboard. A lot of trade press has been full of notices of tech officials going into the administration. Some of them have come back in from after a stint in tech. So I think you're going to see a lot of calls for additional spectrum sharing, more unlicensed spectrum. And, again, that's a good debate to have, but I would caution policymakers not to go for unlicensed or lightly licensed for the sake of having unlicensed, because, it does great, wonderful things and broadens the accessibility of that spectrum, without thinking about the international parameters, right? Because gone are the days where the US can make a policy decision and just expect the rest of the world will follow, or just make a policy decision and not care if the world follows because the US market alone is enough. That's not where the world is today. Anybody who's going to undertake serious investment needs a global market, in the tech space and in the wireless space. And as Commissioner Carr was kind of alluding to in response to one of the questions about why is the world led, the rest of the world is not as comfortable with unlicensed spectrum, with spectrum sharing, and and in some bands they should be, but if the U.S. is going to continue to push unlicensed spectrum policy around the world, they really need to build that comfort level, both in the industry side as well as policymakers, because it's just there's very few countries that really have embraced it like the U.S. has.
As you bring up other countries
done, and there are. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Is there anyone that is doing a part of this that we think we'd want to emulate, or do you feel like we're really leading in this space?
Well, we're leading in one aspect where that's an exception is Europe. They actually did make available much of the 6 gigahertz band before we did, with pretty advantageous rules that many of the U.S. tech companies were actively working on for years, in Europe. However, they so they've done that in the 6 gigahertz band, for the next generation of Wi-Fi 6, based on 802.11ax, wider channelization, faster speeds, all those good things. But they did not make the entire band available for unlicensed devices like the FCC did back in April. But yeah, they've embraced it. Korea and Japan have embraced unlicensed devices in some of the bands. In Korea, also in the whole 1200 megahertz of the 6 gigahertz band. So there's a handful, but it's definitely not critical mass yet in the world.
Peter, there's a lot of agendas in all of this, so I always want to go back to the engineer to say, is what we're looking at viable? Are we doing this in a way that makes sense? I realize
are you asking about spectrum sharing in general?
Yeah, and just how we're managing, moving the spectrum, as we're finding market mechanisms to move certain pieces of the spectrum, and then basically trying to push other parts of, like we talked about the interagency process. They've got a lot of spectrum that may not be at its best current use. But when you just say like, okay, we're for what we're trying to do with next generation networks and 5G and mobile and things with Wi-Fi, are we making good decisions as an engineer? Do you think like we're heading on the right path?
I think we're making some good decisions. In some areas, maybe we've been overly ambitious. The problem is that all spectrum is accounted for. You can't find any piece of spectrum, at least in lower bands, say below 50 gigahertz, where there isn't somebody already using the spectrum. So there's a number of factors technologically that are happening that are influencing this environment. One is that systems are becoming more efficient. So a system that used to need 100 megahertz of spectrum now might be spectrally more efficient and only needs 20 megahertz of spectrum to accomplish the same purpose. So you can free up spectrum that way, yet at the same time, there are now more entities wanting to use spectrum, and also our bandwidth requirements are going up. In general, it seems like there's a greater need for spectrum efficiency. It is true that with spectrum sharing, if you have one entity that's using spectrum lightly, only occasionally using it, it does make sense that you might want to try and share that spectrum with some other entity. And that was really the genesis of CBRS, where you had Navy radar systems that only occasionally use spectrum. The problem with any spectrum sharing solution, though, is that it ends up being very complex. There are dozens of operating parameters for any one system. And so to try and meld two different systems in the same environment requires a lot of attention to detail, a lot of items that have to be studied and engineered. A case in point is CBRS, where it took 8 years to go from the initial NPRM to licensing of the spectrum. So even though CBRS is a relatively simple spectrum sharing approach in the grand DSA scheme, it still took 8 years. The problem then is, how do you time any spectrum sharing innovation so that you get the best market value of the spectrum and so that the country is most competitive in a global competitive landscape?
Well, it seems like technology itself could change so much in 8 years too. Like by the time you get that decision made, you're like, are we even still thinking about that? It's interesting. I can only imagine how many different entities must be involved too, between the standards bodies, the engineering, bodies that are around, however they're using it, which, if they're arguing over which part of the spectrum they think that it should get placed. And I know, Tricia, you've done a lot of work on that internationally to make sure that if we're not going to have collaboration, we don't have friction in how those things move forward. And I'm always fascinated. Years ago, you used to before our phones would automatically port to whatever was going on. You just if you had the wrong carrier, you'd go to a country and it wouldn't work. And we don't seem to have those issues today. So we figured that part out. But in the bigger picture, what are some of the conflicts we're having, both internationally? We heard about the ones domestically. I'm kind of curious to see if we're headed into any dangerous paths internationally.
Yeah, well, I'll start on CBRS, which is a tiered, sharing structure, and Peter's referred to it, right? But yes, it took a lot of time. Technology is changing. We're seeing where I won't get too detailed, but where the government data is being sent out to warn lightly licensed users to get off the bands because of Navy radar coming in, or other radar, or the protection zone around a particular installation, a military installation, perhaps not being, needed to be as broad geographically, that they are refining those protection zones and how quick people can move. So you are seeing some improvement in the technology so that there's overall greater access, to the spectrum by the lightly licensed, Wi-Fi CBRS basic, or, the CBRS devices, which are basically LTE, maybe 5G one day. But to your point on international, proponents of CBRS took that tiered structure, lightly licensed, dynamic spectrum, informed by a database, to international standards bodies, but there was no takers. It is too complex. And in international circles where they're not as used to sharing spectrum, it was just all too foreign and crazy. And why would you do this? And of course, the U.S. military is a larger user of radar than a lot of other entities. Obviously, you got China and Russia, who are big military users as well. But so you definitely saw tension to your question. You saw tension in the international spectrum standards bodies, like, no, don't bring in that crazy tiered stuff here. We don't want to talk about it. So there is that. And then broadly, to Joel's point about like government users, and tensions with commercial users. I mean, all those government agencies we love and know and who protect us and tell us about the weather and do lots of good things for us. They've got international counterparts, right? There's the European Space Agency, and there's, the radio astronomers over in Europe, Corf. I mean, they have counterparts. The arguments domestically are amplified internationally. So we have them there as well. And they'll play out. They do continuously. And they certainly played out at the last World Radio Conference about a year and a quarter. And they'll be playing out, in the next one in 2023.
Joel, I know you have put in comments on Legato, which has been front and center in a lot of this. Can you catch us up? How what's going on? Maybe give us a little bit of background on how Legato became such a hot issue.
Yeah, well, it's the issue that never dies in the spectrum world, really, because I think this is going on close to 20 years. So to give everyone a high level of what's going on with Legato or how we got here, this actually predates Chairman Pai, it predates Janikowski. It actually goes, I think, as far back as 17 years. But so that I don't want to do a whole descriptive account of what exactly happened, because I think that at that point we could do a whole law course on just procedure and how to allocate spectrum. But right now, I think that Legato is basically good to go. I mean, the big issue really was Congress and the push that the National Defense Authorization Act had, or had the language that the NDA had in relation to Legato. But ultimately, I think where we are now is that Legato seems to be on a clear path to operate. I mean, I don't see the NDA really affecting how the FCC's order, because back in 2009, I think 2019, or 2020, the FCC promulgated an.
We all kind of.
I think, like most people, I want to forget 2020 happened. So so I probably did that a bit subconsciously. So in early 2020, the FCC decided to move forward on a application from Legato that essentially just tried to reformat their license to provide a 5G IoT systems, or help at least do some sort of amplification of 5G IoT systems. Well, in adjacent bands, there were a lot of folks in the GPS world who did not feel like the FCC was strongly considering their particular perspectives. The DoD also felt like that their GPS operations would be affected, even though there was no real evidence to suggest that the DoD systems would be affected in a certain way. But I'll let the record speak for itself. And ultimately, what happened was that the chairman of the FCC decided that, well, I took in the record. I've heard both sides of the argument. I've worked with NTIA. I've worked with, I worked with the DoD through the NTIA, dealt with all the agencies. I think we have a good enough record. And so they promulgated an order that allowed for Legato's modification with significant restrictions, like a 23 gigahertz guard band, basically a stop buzzer that can be executed within 15 minutes. I mean, there's just a slew of things that Legato cannot do. But I think, and the DoD saw this and said, you know what, this is a little bit too close to the vest for us. We don't think that we want to. We don't think that the FCC did consider these different factors, even though, which one was they didn't measure interference based on how we measure interference, which I believe is they used a 1 dB standard, but Peter's probably the person to talk to about the difference between 1 dB and the way the FCC actually does measures harmful interference. But the FCC used the traditional measure of harmful interference. DoD disputed that and inadvertently took the fight to Congress, and Congress ultimately found some of the DoD's arguments persuasive, put some language in there that basically said the FCC, the DoD is allowed to measure the level of interference, but they have to use the FCC standard. So it's a huge win for the FCC. But again, like I think that but the real story here isn't that Legato can now operate and the DoD lost. The real story here is how much agencies are willing to take these types of fights to the mat and the extent to which they're willing to go in order to fight a decision that they feel is either not handled well by an independent agency like the FCC, or if they feel like they want to slow down the pace with the role Congress plays and the role that Congress and DoD have in some of these spectrum battles. So I think that really what we're looking at here is just a matter of figuring out how do we work together on this, because Peter's written a lot about the DoD and how much spectrum they use. I mean, they are a large government user of spectrum, particularly in the mid-band space. And mid-band is critical for deployment of 5G. So, or even 4G LTE, because the way we've basically structured our 5G plan is we're going to build on top of 4G. So you have not just government actors, you have private stakeholders who have an interest in these bands. So we have to figure out a way to coordinate, and we have to figure out a way to really be able to have these conversations and deploy quickly, because some of the things that have been proffered, of course, I'm referring to the DoD RFI, where they're talking about is, I think we started off with like the crazy lack of distinction between spectrum sharing and spectrum access. So I think that we've got to really hunker down and figure out what's the goal here. Like, what do we ultimately want to accomplish, and how can we do this in a way that not necessarily satisfies everyone, because anyone that's been a part of negotiation, Tricia, I know, in your experience, any sort of negotiation, no one's ever happy, and that's how you know it was a good one. So us as attorneys realize that we're not going to get everything, but we have to be at least moving the ball forward in some way, and that's going to be the struggle I see for this, for the Biden administration, whatever administration comes next. But that's so in terms of Legato, the real story here isn't that the DoD was beating up on a system. It was that this is really how hard it is to open up these conversations, and we need to get better and more efficient at it, because as Tricia rightly pointed out, this is getting echoed in the international space, and we need to be coordinated if we're going to have a solid plan to bring more dearth to our 5G networks and wireless networks in general.
A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, no, sorry about that,
Peter, I guess one of the things that he mentioned, interference and not using the same measurement, is that a constant problem that we're having in this space as we're learning how to be friends in the spectrum sharing world?
It's definitely one of the problems. What Joel was referring to with Legato was actually neighboring band interference, where you had a system or a bunch of spectrum that Legato was trying to use, but it was adjacent to GPS. And so there were concerns about interference. And when you have an interference situation, then you do have to go out and measure, and how you measure radio waves is an art in itself. So yes, absolutely. One person's interference measurement method may differ from somebody else's, but I would say that's a relatively minor issue, while in the case of Legato it's a pretty big issue. But in general, measurement approaches is just one of hundreds of considerations in how you deal with different entities sharing spectrum.
What else would you recommend we look at?
Oh, probably the biggest one is how you coordinate different systems accessing spectrum. But even before you start to share spectrum, you really have to look at what is the actual usage model. If one entity is using it frequently, then saying that another entity can use that spectrum when that first entity is not using it, it may result in a resource that is so unpredictable that it really doesn't have any value. right? So even though the notion of sharing sounds good, think about sharing a car. If
Right.
you were just going to use, if a husband was going to use it weekdays and a wife was going to use it on weekends, that's no problem. But throw teenagers in and put in a big family with one car, and suddenly it's unworkable, right? So that's the first question, is who's using what spectrum, how frequently? And then the next question is, well, okay, so you have these two very different types of systems. How do they coexist? That is, in general, an extremely complex problem, because the nature of radio access to begin with is very complex. If you look at Wi-Fi, or if you take 5G or 4G, just how different smartphones share the same spectrum in a single cell is something that requires hundreds of pages of specifications to determine. And then in the case of cellular, it is a coordinated system where the base station decides who gets to transmit when. Wi-Fi, in comparison, is a system where devices listen to the environment, they wait for other devices to stop transmitting, and then they use the radio medium in a very well-defined fashion. So that, again, is a system with hundreds of pages of specifications. In the case of LTE and 5G, we've actually developed ways for cellular and Wi-Fi to share that same spectrum, unlicensed bands. In LTE, it's a capability called license-assisted access, and in 5G, it's a capability called new radio unlicensed. Both of those took years and years to specify, to test, and then to get agreement between the cellular and Wi-Fi communities on how they could coexist in that same environment. So that's the second stage, is coming up with a system to actually allow the systems, the two disparate systems, to share the same radio spectrum. It's a very complicated problem. And what we have to be careful about is that we don't overreach. It's very easy with technology to say, oh, yes, this technology exists, it'll let us do these wonderful things. So look at the Apple iPhone. It's one of the most successful products of all time, but even Apple stumbled because in 1987, they started working on a precursor called the Apple Newton. I don't know if anybody remembers that, which came out in 1993. It completely failed in the marketplace. So here's a extremely successful company saying, yes, we know the future of handheld computers. We're going to develop the Apple Newton. It's going to be a huge success. And the technology just wasn't ready. So similarly, in radio, we have to choose technologies that are appropriate at the time. And what makes things much more complicated is that we're not working in isolation. The whole world right now is competing in the 5G space. So if we come up with requirements for 5G, for example, and some of the new mid-band spectrum in lower 3 gigahertz that place too many constraints on that spectrum and how it's deployed, we run the risk of putting ourselves at a global competitive disadvantage.
Yeah, no, there's, again, you just gave a whole lot. And for those who are really appreciating hearing all this from Peter, he's got some great information on, you can catch on the web. And I'm looking at some of your documents are always good because you graph this out very nicely. But let's go to Wi-Fi, because I know that the 6 gig, and I realize this gets confusing, 5G, 6 gig. But how did that seem to go? We kind of marshaled through that. Joel, I'm going to give you the opportunity to say your favorite phrase here.
Well,
TV
so I'm assuming you mean TV white space. That's in 600 meg. I'll spare you. Yeah. Well, I mean, so if you want to talk about 6 gig generally, I mean, the way I at least thought about it was that this seemed to be a clear move from the FCC to create a more contiguous Wi-Fi band in relation to 5.9. So you had a lot of, I mean, again, this goes back to what Peter and Tricia have been saying, which is you have to start thinking about spectrum with and unlicensed spectrum with purpose. So what's and I think this commission specifically, the PI Commission, really was, I thought they were very thoughtful in the way they tried to open up more unlicensed bands. And I mean, if you want me to talk about TV white space, I'm happy to do it. But I think that, but I think in terms of 6 gig, it's its own monster. So you have really the way to think about the 6 gig is to also connect it to 5.9, because you have to think about it in terms of what the FCC's goal was. Their goal ultimately was to create more density in Wi-Fi. And so you're dealing with two different types of stakeholders. You're on the 5.9 side, you're dealing with DOT, well, not DOT as a whole, mainly it was NHTSA, which is a subset of DOT I think it's the National Highway
Traffic Safety Administration.
Thank you. Yeah. So Shane, that's why I love being on any webinar or anything that you're on, because you always help me out with the acronyms.
I need to know acronyms. Wow. Yeah.
No, and it's acronyms too, so that's helpful. So anyway, so NHTSA was really the one that put forward their grievances with the FCC. So the FCC had that battle to wage. Then you have 6 gigahertz, and there was, private stakeholders that had their views. So the tech companies, as Tricia noted, were very interested in opening up this band for various reasons. Then you have cable that has their interest as well. And you match that with some of the other wireless folks who were kind of a bit of reticence to appreciate what the FCC did, but ultimately said, this is okay. But again, this opens up that conversation with the fact that these spectrum issues are not, as Peter rightly noted, they're very complicated, and they involve a lot of different stakeholders. And so it's going to, and it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, as Peter talked about, CBRS was decided in 2012, and we just started Spectrum 8 years ago. Legato was basically started 17 years ago. C-band, God knows how long we've been talking about C-band, but I mean, even then, that's escalated, and that took close to 5 or 6 years if you're measuring it conservatively. So you really have, any FCC has to really consider what it takes to open up these types of, and it's not going to happen overnight. But so what the PI administration, or what the PI FCC did was very impressive, at least in my mind, in terms of working on the clearing aspects of spectrum. But I mean, even if you want to talk about TV white space and the 600 megahertz spectrum, that has to do with the repack that happened, I think, in 2012, and then it finally finished around 2018, 2019. And so you're dealing with broadcasters who are trying to figure out where they're placed, and also finding a place for folks like T-Mobile and Dish to open up more 5G or 4G, really just 4G LTE capabilities. And then somewhere along the lines, you've got to find unlicensed space for a Microsoft to open up its TV white spaces or TV white space technology. So it's just, I mean, again, it's going to take a lot of coordination, and it's not simple. I hope that I don't come off as like beating up on the government, because the government is not necessarily the only players here that the FCC has to be considerate of, but it's also private stakeholders. So I think, again, it's going to take a lot of thought. It's going to take time, but ultimately these issues are not going away, whether you're talking about private stakeholders or public stakeholders.
Tricia, you have been in this space for quite some time. How are we doing? Are we on the right path here on spectrum sharings? I realize there's a combination of sharing, then we have the auctions, which we have got people that want to have their own space. I mean, are all these dialogues pushing us forward into where we want to be for next generation networks?
Yes, we're moving forward. It is deliberative. As several speakers have noted, the US has led in terms of making more efficient use of spectrum, but everybody wants their own spectrum, and government's needs of spectrum are growing too. They would argue, you want DoD to have 5G capability, right? We want them to be the best warfighters in the space, right? So that they have needs too, but and we're pushing the envelope internationally. I mean, to Joel's point, or about C-band, right? With C-band clearing what was satellite spectrum, and now in the middle of an auction that's over $80 billion. The mobile industry has been gunning for that for years. I mean, that was put on a World Radio Conference agenda in 2012 for discussion and deliberation in 2015. And, we got nothing. We got a few footnotes, I won't get into all that, but a few countries said, well, we don't care if the rest of the world's not going to go along. Damn it, we want our mid-band spectrum. We know this is good stuff. And they, changed their own allocation in the World Radio table of allocations. But, that was for years and years and years. And then, at the last fork, at the the World Radio Conference in 2019, a few more countries put their names in for identifying portions of that 3 gigahertz C-band and below. And so yes, the US is to be commended that despite all of our legitimately competing interests for spectrum between government and satellite and terrestrial, license, unlicensed, we are moving the ball forward because we really, unlike many other regulators, even people who have made bold decisions too, like the Europeans, like the Koreans, like the Japanese, we do have a much more deliberative, open process between our spectrum regulator and the industry. That's kind of baked into who Americans are. We have the Administrative Procedures Act. We have notice and comment rulemaking. So we have a well-funded FCC with lots of smart engineers. Of course, we could always use more, but we are set up to have that discussion and to keep pushing the ball forward, as well as lots of think tanks, right? We have lots of different groups that contribute to these discussions, and so it's a whirligig, very populist policy space, but all said, we are moving the ball forward down the field better than any other government in this lovely planet of ours.
Tricia, as a fellow attorney, I just wanted to say that getting a footnote in anything is very impressive. So well done.
So what are the hot topics at the World Radio Conference right now that you are managing?
That I'm managing? Well, are you asking me as the head of the advisory committee? I mean, there are a ton of issues that are being deliberated. We do have some mid-band items, mid-band spectrum for 5G, what the ITU calls international mobile telephony or telecom now. And that's, for looking at the 3 gigahertz band, which is front and center here in the US as well. And then that agenda item is hot and heavy, both in our own region of the Americas, as well as what's called Region 1 in the United Nations, which is Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. 6 gigahertz is in the crosshairs. The Chinese got Africa to go along with them for pushing to have an agenda item to look at the same 6 gigahertz band for effectively licensed 5G services. Europe, which had already, pardon?
So you're saying that China wants it for licensed 5G versus it being for the current, what we're using it for Wi-Fi?
Yes, because Huawei, has a lot of influence with its government and vice versa, right? They convinced, they were looking for the whole 6 gigahertz band because Europe had moved earlier to make the lower, the half of the band available for unlicensed. Europe at least was able to hold the line and say, no, you can only just look at the top portion of the band, right? So that's in the crosshairs. Now that's just for Region 1, but that's a whole lot of eyeballs, a whole lot of ears, right? A whole lot of fingers. So, that's very much being discussed. So we do have a mid-band item, a couple of agenda items on that. But frankly, the majority of the agenda items for the World Radio Conference are satellite because there's been a lot of growth in the technology. To your point, doesn't technology change? And I mean, the satellite industry has invested a lot of money on high throughput satellites, on low Earth satellites, non-geosynchronous. So you can be lower to the earth, less latency, and be a real broadband substitute. So the use of, and particularly the use of satellite services while the users or the vehicle is in motion, what's called eSIMs, Earth Station in Motion. So there's a lot of those agenda items. So really the bulk of the work in 2023 is going to be on sharing bands for satellite.
Oh, interesting. Peter, when do they make sure that all this stuff works? Do they actually check in with the engineering bodies and people like you and say, here's the concept. Is this sane, or have they hopefully validated that before they bring it to somebody like the organization that Trish is talking about? World Radio?
I think in general, there's good dialogue amongst all the necessary parties. So I'm not too concerned that people would come up with spectrum policy that is completely disconnected from reality.
So like this 6 gig conversation that Tricia brought up and Joel was talking about earlier, how do we deal with that from both an international and a federal perspective? I guess I'm curious to know, what do we do if China wins in the international sphere and we're like, that wasn't our wish, that's not what we want to do?
Yeah, the 6 gigahertz is interesting because the United States allocated more of 6 gigahertz for unlicensed than anybody else in the world that I'm aware of. So if now China somehow wins and gets some, ITU designation that part of 6 gigahertz can be used for cellular, then that does put the United States at odds with possibly some internationally harmonized spectrum. But that to me is not that big a problem. Most devices today are very agile as far as their radio band usage. So if Wi-Fi uses more spectrum, can use more 6 gigahertz than elsewhere. And if there's a portion of 6 gigahertz that's not available for cellular in the United States, that's not that atypical. Generally, the world is not 100% harmonized. And we try and harmonize spectrum as much as possible internationally, but ultimately every country has its own history of spectrum allocations and may even have different priorities about how spectrum should be used. So I do expect some divergence in how spectrum is allocated on a global basis.
Anybody feel like doing some future casting ideas on where you think this next FCC might be thinking about on spectrum and spectrum sharing and all of the hot topics that are still on the plate?
Well, before people think deep thoughts, Joel and Peter on that, I did just want to add, Korea, South Korea and Brazil have both announced that they are going to make that whole range in 6 gigahertz, the whole 1200 megahertz available for unlicensed, spectrum devices as well. So yes, the US got out ahead, but it does have some fellow travelers, in making the whole band available. But Peter's quite right. The mobile industry, it's not like it's just Huawei, let's be clear. Our beloved and tried and true providers, Ericsson and Nokia and others, and GSMA members generally, they would like the upper band allocated for or identified globally for, for licensed mobile 5G. So anyway, it will be a bit of a patchwork, I think, by the end of the day. But anyway, I'll let the others jump in on futuristic, visionary remarks.
Well, Peter, also you want to take the first next stab, but if you hearing none, well, I think sharing is ultimately going to be part of it. It's just inevitable. And the big issue I think that this FCC will, that the future FCC, if I had a crystal ball, I would say that they're probably going to look at unlicensed, and they're going to try to find new avenues for unlicensed. And so I think that's going to complicate a lot of these other conversations that we're having, particularly in mid-band and the higher bands as well. But if my bet is that it's probably going to focus, based off of the previous Obama administration's view on spectrum, they thought sharing was probably the best way to go. And so I think we're going to see a healthy mix of sharing and potential clearing, but for unlicensed use. But that would be my guess.
I don't know exactly what is going to happen. I don't know if anybody does, but my slight concern about an undue emphasis on sharing is that it could potentially derail some efforts that are already underway. And most importantly, 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz. The $80 billion right now that's in the auction process for C-band shows the huge need that the industry has for mid-band spectrum. Mid-band is really where 5G at this time, given the available technology, that's where provides the greatest benefit relative to spectrum resources. You get the biggest bang for the buck basically in mid-band. And the C-band amount, 280 megahertz, as large as it is not enough. It doesn't allow us to completely catch up to countries such as Japan, Korea, China that have allocated more mid-band spectrum than we have. So the next slice of spectrum that can address that need is 3.45 to 3.55. And at least for 5G success in the United States, I think it's critical that that band look like C-band and that some ambitious spectrum sharing approach is not enforced on that band. So that would be my final comment on the future.
And Peter, just to add to that, I mean, if you think of the bands he's talking about, the prime user in that is the DoD. So that means that, pay attention, folks. What you saw before might happen again, because as we get closer to those types of bands, and Peter's absolutely right, those are critical bands. With the DoD, the interaction with the FCC and DoD is going to be a fun thing to watch moving forward.
And then can I
terrifying.
All right, and I would just add it. Yeah, those are going to be the location where we have that debate on whether the structure should be more sharing, like in CBRS, or more exclusive license, like in C-band. But the FCC just yesterday, or I guess they voted it before the meeting, dropped a notice of proposed rulemaking, really more like a notice of inquiry on 12 gigahertz and 500 megahertz there, and 12.2 to 12.7. So that's certainly going to be an area. That currently is licensed to some satellite companies as well as terrestrial, links. So, and we've already seen proponents of unlicensed wanting access to that. And I'm sure the mobile industry wouldn't mind another auction there. So we're going to have a lot of debate in that band as well.
Yeah, I think the discussion may be more about, should we be doing as many sharing, continuing with this sharing concept, or the free and clear spectrum as we're seeing with C-band. And I completely take your point, Peter, that we're definitely seeing an amazing success in that auction, which tells us that that's kind of the market speaking, I think, at this juncture. We are open for questions, and so far the few I have, I feel like we've answered, but just in case, let me just say, one specific one is, will the Biden FCC follow, or are they more likely to reverse the Trump's FCC wireless infrastructure policies? Anybody's got a comment on that?
That's a good question. If they mean by infrastructure, if they mean, with the 5G order, 5G orders, or like the 5G upgrade orders, I'm assuming that's what they mean. So if they mean that, then they potentially might, only because Democrat-leaning FCCs have been very receptive to local and state governments. And local and state governments have really put forward a strong opposition to what the FCC has done in almost every 5G order that was promulgated. So I would expect that it probably, one could look at that and say, well, the damage is done, and then we have the orders, and there's no reason to do a certain amount of reversions. But I could see a world where you look at the Trump administration, or the PI FCC's orders, and maybe potentially having the opportunity for these types of stakeholders, state and local governments, request a declaratory ruling, and that could alter the scope of these orders potentially. But so the answer is kind of I hate to give like that lawyerly answer, it depends, but it ultimately comes down to that, where it depends on how receptive the next chairman is to local and state government's gripes.
Anybody have further thoughts on Joel's comments?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with everything Joel said. Just to give some specificity, the PI FCC put out a limit. They said basically for every small cell, a city can charge no more than $500, and per zoning permit, to hook up the small cell to the tower, or to a building or a light pole, what they call street furniture. And then they had a procedural clarification too, like you can't sit on an application forever. You have to respond by a certain number of days. You have to give a green light or a red light. You have to much more transparency. And funny enough, the small cities were like, oh, great, thanks for the guidance. We can't wait to build up 5G to attract, more businesses, or keep our millennials home where they can get broadband. You had pushback from the big cities who, have the population and the leverage to say, no, we're gonna, charge you $100,000 and sit on this for as long as we want. So, but anyway, just for a little clarification, that in part, that's why I think you saw the great surge in that, plus the spectrum being available, and mounting these cell towers, and then the small cells all over the place to build out 5G, because there was procedural reform in that space. So, but the local governments are already champing at the bit and talking about how they're going to roll back and restore their right to charge whatever they want for as long as they want.
Let me just add that The success of 5G in the long term really depends on being able to use a lot more spectrum than we're currently using in cellular networks, in particular millimeter wave bands, 20 gigahertz and higher, offer huge amounts of spectrum. And with that spectrum, 5G can provide gigabit per second types of speeds. It is a direct viable replacement or competitive alternative for cable and fiber in some scenarios. So the success of 5G as a generalized wide area broadband solution requires use of those higher bands. But the problem with those higher bands is that they don't propagate as well. So you really need these small cells. And ultimately, if the United States is going to have this super powered network of the future, it's going to require hundreds of thousands and ultimately millions of these small cells. So if there's a lot of resistance in local environments, it really will be a problem for 5G.
It doesn't, I mean, I definitely, we've all heard about certain people that have concerns about 5G that seem to be, in my view, unwarranted. They don't hold with a lot of facts, but it is curious. I know that Commissioner Carr mentioned the city in Indiana that, was a smaller town and they were seeing the value of it. So it'll be interesting to see what some of the localities do as far as seeing this as a possible economic uptake to help their small businesses, especially after we've gone through COVID and a lot of people are looking for anything to drive, business back to Main Street, versus kind of getting greedy at the trough with just licensing. That's what Tricia, what you're talking about is just, just the ability to put the mechanism up to create the 5G environment. If they're going to make that such a prohibitive cost, you're never going to get there. So we have lots of examples of that in other parts of this industry. So we just have a couple minutes left. I would like to any closing thoughts on this topic or 5G or anything that you want to say for the good of the order? Trish, I'll start with you.
Darn.
You said Joel?
No, I said Joel.
You said,
this is Joel. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Well, just that I commend you for holding this discussion, Shane. It's great that AEI is focusing on spectrum policy going into a new administration. I mean, 5G is so critical. I think that is why, certainly DOD and the whole administration last cycle finally decided, okay, we've been worrying about the spectrum for decades, but this is so critical. And why it's so critical, frankly, is, well, it does great things for the economy and can help us with telehealth and all this stuff, but also because China has made it a priority. I mean, it was in China's 2025 plan, and this is one area they plan to dominate. And because 5G is a great technology to leverage some other critical technologies like artificial intelligence, right? So it is existential that the US be competitive in 5G. And so I think it's great that you are continuing the discussion alive as we start another administration.
Thanks. We'll be getting into AI and other items that definitely over the labor and the importance of the economy as well further in this year. Joel, you can go next. You're so eager.
First of all, you said Joel. I blame my bad hearing. But I would agree with everything that Tricia said, that this is an incredibly important issue. And I hope that this next iteration of the commission follows, at least in some respects, what the PI commission did as it relates to spectrum, and basically take sort of all the above approach. And I think because that's ultimately what's going to open up more dialogues, and I think ultimately open up more spectrum so that we can all use them. So I hope that's where we're headed, and it'll be fun to watch.
Interesting. Peter, last words?
Sure. A lot of my work is looking at the evolution of technology and how long it takes to accomplish what. Given where we are, it's no question that there will be ever more sharing of spectrum. It ultimately is a logical way of managing sharing, but I think a realistic time frame for widespread sharing of cellular with other systems is to spend the rest of this decade analyzing what is possible and put that into the requirements for the next generation of cellular, which would be 6G. Right now, there's just a lot of advanced work and high-level thinking about what 6G might be. That is the perfect place to slot in a more sophisticated spectrum sharing approach.
Great comments. Thank you all for your time, not only today, but in the work that you do, because I know how important it is. I love my devices. I'm sitting amongst many of them right now. I know it's made my life viable during this last year, and it continues to really help not only our economy, all the things that we're doing, but we need to take the next steps, and the ideas around spectrum sharing and how we're managing 5G is critical, and you all are really a vital part of that. So thank you. I want to appreciate you, the work that you do. And thank everybody for joining us today on this discussion at AEI. I hope you'll join us for further conversations. And always check out techpolicydaily.com, where we have a daily discussion on all things communication. So thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.